Sometimes it's not the technology that stands in the way of progress. Have you ever seen an article that says, "The cure for cancer is right around the corner," or "Magical new treatment stuns researchers"? It feels like a new miracle drug pops up every single day. But surely, if that were true, we would have eradicated all illness by now. Why is it so hard to go from potential to reality? What is stopping all of these medicines from reaching the shelves? This is a story about the pharmaceutical industry and what happens to miracle cures after the headlines fade. It's no secret that for journalists in our modern world, crafting a title that grabs attention is an essential skill. Look no further than right here on YouTube. Clickbait is rampant, and even if you have something interesting to share, you still have to craft an interesting title and thumbnail or else no one's going to see it. But this doesn't mesh very well with science, which needs to be empirical and trustworthy in order to guide public policy and medical guidelines. So what happens when sensationalist journalism meets medical research? We get headlines every other day, claiming that some new miracle treatment has been uncovered and is about to change the world. In reality, science takes time. Every medicine in your pharmacy is the culmination of decades of research. But therein lies the issue. Scientific papers are huge. They often have an enormous amount of baseline assumed knowledge, as well as referencing 100 other papers that you need to read beforehand in order to get the full picture. There's a reason that scientists are so specialized, that one scientist can devote their entire life to the reproduction of a specific species of frog, and it's because mastering a niche takes a lifetime. But that body of work is just unrealistic for a journalist who has to publish 6 more articles before end of day in order to meet her quota. Yet, the context is super important if you want to draw accurate conclusions from a scientific paper. The methods, the statistical analysis, the previous findings, they tell the overall story. Not just what was found, but how it was found, and whether the findings are meaningful. A great example of the media hype machine is resveratrol and red wine. Studies published in the 90s and early 2000s identified that resveratrol, a chemical found in the skin of red grapes, might have various health benefits, providing cardiovascular protection and slowing aging, which sounds great. Naturally, media outlets immediately reported on the incredible health benefits of red wine, how drinking a glass a day can help stop you getting cancer. But the resveratrol studies were all conducted either in the lab or in animals. And the doses of resveratrol used in these studies was way higher than anything you'd naturally get from drinking red wine. So there was no way to draw any accurate conclusions about the effectiveness of resveratrol in humans, let alone the health benefits of red wine. These studies simply highlighted something that was interesting and was possibly worth studying further. And when that happened, subsequent studies found no significant link between resveratrol consumption and longevity or decreased cancer risk. In fact, alcohol is a group 1 carcinogen, so drinking red wine is far more likely to cause cancer than prevent it. Yet, the myth that red wine is good for you is still around today. A lot of the time, news reports jump straight to the conclusion of a scientific paper and dress up the most exciting sentence they can find, preferably something about a breakthrough, a key link, or maybe a cure. Sometimes this is completely innocent. Journalists are just trying to capture the most important part of the article. Sometimes it's not as innocent, because the reality is, promising early-stage trial shows improvement in mice doesn't draw clicks. Scientists may have found the cure to cancer, does. But this isn't always the media's fault. Sometimes the hype begins earlier, with the researchers themselves. Scientists don't just publish papers to share their knowledge with the world. It's how they get promotions, it's how they get grants, it's how their lab survives. And in that kind of environment where you constantly need to prove that what you're doing is valuable, interesting results are as good as gold, even when the foundations of the study are not necessarily solid. In the pharmaceutical industry, it's publish or perish. Researchers are constantly being evaluated by everyone around them. The number of publications they have to their name, the prestige of the journals they've been published in, and most importantly, how many times their work has been cited by others. If you're not familiar with scientific research, scientists have their own little LinkedIn called ResearchGate. They all get a profile which lists their latest works and shows how many other people have referenced their stuff. The bigger the number, the more authority you have in the field, which makes you cooler. But on top of the inherently human desire for external validation, scientists often rely on funding from research grants. This means they need to regularly pitch their work to investors in order to keep the lights on in their lab. This pressure is intense, and it can lead to a focus on producing positive or interesting results, sometimes at the expense of rigorous methodology. The system is designed to reward noise over nuance. Negative results, which are crucially important, often go unpublished. A 2024 survey found that 72% of biomedical researchers believe we are in a reproducibility crisis, with 62% blaming the publish or perish culture. A study is reproducible if you or someone else can copy exactly what you did the first time and get the same results. In a perfect world, every study would be double-checked by someone else, just to make sure that nothing weird happened the first time. But investors aren't really interested in finding out, yeah, we got it right the first time. However, with so many studies not being reproducible, we end up wasting time and resources chasing dead ends. There are many cases of scientists uncovering a link between some molecule and a disease and publishing their findings. Then, when another lab secures funding to try and follow up that research, they find out that there isn't actually a link at all. Because pharmaceutical research is so dependent on collaboration, results that aren't reproducible can harm the entire industry. And even if a potential new drug makes it through the hype, survives the pressure to publish, and catches the attention of investors, that's still just the beginning. In order for a drug to make it to the shelves, it needs to pass the dreaded trial process. There are essentially 5 stages of this process, and each one is a massive bottleneck that sends thousands of hopeful scientists back to the drawing board. So, you think you've found a link between a molecule and disease? Time to take it to the preclinical trials. Here we're looking at biological activity, basic safety, and dosage information. And in 1 to 3 short years we'll have our answers. This phase is done on animals. If your original findings weren't reproducible, this is your stop. 90% of potential drugs fail at this stage for one reason or another. Next up is phase 1. Now we're testing on humans. Healthy humans though. Don't want to accidentally mess with someone who's already sick. This step focuses on the toxicity and side effects of the drug at different dosages. It takes about 1 year, and roughly 40% of drugs that make it to this stage fail. Phase 2 is next. Now we can give the drug to a small group of people who actually have the condition you're trying to treat. We're going to monitor them for the next 1 to 2 years, but we're not super interested in whether the drug's actually helping them or not at this point. We just want to make sure that sick people can actually handle your treatment. 70% of the time they can't, and you stop at phase 2. Time for phase 3. Now we finally actually find out whether the drug does what it's supposed to do. Here we do a bigger test on a larger number of people with the disease you actually want to treat. It takes place over the course of 2 to 4 years. This is the big one. If there were any longer term side effects that weren't picked up in the earlier stage, they'll be picked up here. And this stage also has a sample size big enough to actually draw conclusions about how effective the drug is. 50% of drugs that make it to this stage get regulatory approval from the FDA, meaning they can go on the market. But that's still not quite the end of the road. Phase 4 is post-marketing surveillance. Your drug is on the shelves, but the FDA is still watching closely for any side effects that are really rare or really long term. And they're also watching the real world effectiveness. And this phase lasts forever actually. The FDA can pull a drug from the shelves whenever they like. So, doing the maths here, the trial process takes 10 to 15 years, and only 1% of potential drugs make it through. Of the failures, 50 to 60% aren't effective enough at treating the disease. The link that was originally identified just isn't strong enough, or it's only effective under specific conditions. 30% are too dangerous. They might have worked in the lab, but the dosage required for them to work in humans is just too high and causes too many side effects. But that leaves 10 to 15% of drugs that are effective at treating the disease in humans and also don't cause serious side effects that still don't make it through the trials. That's because on top of all of the requirements of the trials themselves, new medicines are also competing with existing medicines. If a new drug isn't an improvement over what's already available on the market, it's not worth producing. Sometimes a study really does produce incredibly promising results, and the media aren't overstating things when they say that it could change the world. But being promising isn't enough. A new medicine has to clear all of the scientific hurdles and the logistical ones too. So to recap, you've spent over a decade developing your drug to help people in need. You've jumped through the flaming hoops of regulation, survived the gauntlet that is the trial process, and finally, your drug has been approved. Congratulations! It's time for you to finally do what all scientists dream of doing. Maximizing shareholder profits. That's right, once a drug gets to this stage, it's no longer about helping people. It's about patents, profits, and pricing structures, baby. And if your miracle drug doesn't look like $1 billion blockbuster, well, maybe it wasn't such a miracle drug after all. It's true. Sometimes a medicine might be objectively better for the majority of potential patients, but pharmaceutical companies will still choose to shelve it in favor of something else. In medicine, the goal should be to cure you, but in business, why would I sell you a cure when I could sell you a monthly treatment instead? This dissonance between what's best for people and what's best for profit creates distrust between healthcare providers and the general public. And honestly, can you blame them? For a one-off treatment to be profitable, it has to be dramatically better than everything else on the market. Take Casgevy, for example, the first CRISPR-based treatment approved for sickle cell anemia and beta thalassemia. It's a permanent fix, not an ongoing treatment. It's a revolutionary drug that uses cutting-edge, brand-new technology. But the only reason Casgevy exists at all is because it costs $2.2 million per patient. Something tells me the execs were a little bit more excited about that number than the number of lives that it can change. My last video takes a closer look at the science and ethics around the technology that Casgevy uses. Check it out after this if you're interested. Are you right there? Are you okay? I made that this morning. Are you done? Are you done? It's not stable. That's not stable. You can only monopolize the market if you can patent your products. Without patents, there's nothing to stop another company from taking your product, making it, and selling it cheaper than you do. When a company spends 10 to 15 years developing a drug, they want to guarantee that they can see some return from it. When a new treatment is developed, companies will file for a 20-year pharmaceutical patent. This 20-year period begins when they start development, so it includes the whole trial period. During that time, only the company is allowed to make and sell the drug in question. Once the patent expires, generic versions can enter the market using the same active ingredient but at a way cheaper price. So companies will do everything in their power to extend these patents, and they won't even bother researching a drug that can't be patented in the first place. This means that potential new applications for already existing drugs largely get ignored. Low-dose naltrexone was originally developed to treat addiction, but some research suggests it might be useful in patients with autoimmune conditions like Crohn's, fibromyalgia, and multiple sclerosis. But naltrexone was first approved in 1984. The original version of the drug has long since been replaced by generic versions, and this means that there's no money in researching it further. And without more research, doctors won't risk prescribing it to someone with autoimmune disease. Maybe it would help them, maybe it wouldn't. The point is, we won't get a conclusive answer because there is no financial incentive to get a conclusive answer. These pharmaceutical patents are the key to the entire industry, and pharma companies can be absolutely ruthless when it comes to protecting their bottom line. In the early 1980s, a virus that would rattle the world was taking root. Human immunodeficiency virus, or HIV, quickly became a global health emergency. HIV is different to a lot of other viruses in that it attacks the body's immune cells, directly engaging the body in a fight. Without treatment, it will progress into acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, otherwise known as AIDS. The danger of HIV doesn't just come from the disease itself, but the fact that it crushes your immune system, making you extremely vulnerable to other infections and diseases. It spread rapidly through sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, and among marginalized communities in the US and Europe. At its peak, millions of people were dying every year, and there was no treatment that seemed to help. HIV actively hides inside human cells and can stay dormant for huge periods of time, meaning that even drugs that were able to kill it were often not able to find it. Because of this, there was a massive push to develop new treatments as quickly as possible. Antiretroviral drugs revolutionized the way the virus was treated, and they became a light at the end of the tunnel for a lot of families struggling during this epidemic. But pharmaceutical companies weren't just about to hand them over to people in need. They were charging upwards of $10,000 per patient per year for their life-saving treatments. And these profits were protected by pharmaceutical patents, meaning nobody was allowed to make a cheaper generic version, even though the disease was actively killing people across the world. Unless, of course, they decided to ignore the patents. Most countries were bound by the TRIPS agreement, a binding treaty from the World Trade Organization that forced its members to recognize and respect pharmaceutical patents internationally. But India wasn't a part of the World Trade Organization, so TRIPS meant nothing to them. They recognized patents on the drug development process, but not on the end product. This meant Indian pharmaceutical companies like Cipla were able to reverse engineer the antiretroviral drugs and make their own. South Africa and Brazil were two other countries that weren't yet bound by the TRIPS agreement, either due to local laws or not yet ratifying their agreement. This loophole meant that these countries and others who were getting decimated by HIV and couldn't afford the premium prices that big pharmaceutical companies were charging were able to buy the treatments from India for as little as $300 per patient per year, a fraction of the cost. The pharmaceutical execs were furious. They banded together and sued South Africa for trying to import the cheaper generic drugs. They lobbied the countries in the World Trade Organization to pressure the countries in need to block Indian exports, and all the while people were dying. Activist groups rallied behind the generic drug makers. Protests occurred all over the globe, condemning the stance that the World Trade Organization had taken. The late Indian Prime Minister Indira Gandhi famously said, "My idea of a better ordered world is one in which medical discoveries would be free of patents and there would be no profiteering from life or death." Eventually, in 2001, public pressure won out. The lawsuit against the South African government was dropped and the generics were allowed to be imported, and they turned the tide of the HIV epidemic. It was a huge win for equitable access, a huge win for activism, and it didn't last. In 2005, India joined the World Trade Organization and adopted their patent rules. The pharmacy of the developing world was gone. The World Trade Organization did introduce some safeguards to try and stop history from repeating itself. Compulsory licensing, which means that in an emergency, countries can grant permission to local companies to produce generics, but they have to notify and negotiate with the World Trade Organization to do so. And in practice, pharmaceutical companies and World Trade Organization nations tend to end up pressuring them not to. The Doha Declaration was signed in 2001. It mandates that World Trade Organization members must take actions to protect public health in the event of an emergency, even if intellectual property laws must be disregarded. But unlike the TRIPS agreement, the Doha Declaration is a statement of intent rather than a legally binding document, so it's barely worth the paper it's written on. Voluntary licensing means that pharma companies can grant permission to develop generics to low-income countries without granting the permission to other countries if they choose to. There are organizations that negotiate with the pharmaceutical companies on behalf of low-income nations to try and get access when they're in need, but at the end of the day, it's still voluntary. Companies don't have to help if they don't want to. So really, all of these measures are weak, and with India joining the World Trade Organization, somehow pharmaceutical companies managed to come out the other side of the HIV epidemic with more leverage than they had before. And just recently, a new global business opportunity emerged. Every big pharmaceutical company in the world was foaming at the mouth with excitement. That opportunity was the COVID-19 pandemic. When the disease hit, the race was on to be the first company to develop a COVID-19 vaccine. Not just because lives were at stake, but because every government on Earth would be lining up to buy as many doses as they could afford. Being the first company to develop a vaccine would mean billions of dollars, so pharmaceutical companies put everything else on hold. And in an incredible feat of science and collaboration, the first COVID vaccines hit the market less than 12 months after development started. But South Africa and India had seen this before. In 2020, they proposed a TRIPS waiver, suspending intellectual property rights for COVID-19 related treatments, including tests, vaccines, ventilators, and antivirals. These IP barriers were slowing down global production, meaning not every country had access to the treatments that they so desperately needed. Yet this waiver was opposed by the United States, United Kingdom, European Union, Canada, Switzerland, and Japan, all first world nations that had absolutely no concern about their access to these treatments. They argued that the waiver would undermine innovation and that the IP laws actually weren't the problem. It was the supply chain, which they also didn't fix. And most importantly, they argued that the waiver could set a dangerous precedent for future pandemics. In June of 2022, after 2 years of negotiation, a watered-down version of the waiver was finally passed. It only applied to patents, not trade secrets, which were pretty much vital to developing mRNA vaccines, as the technology behind them was essentially brand new. And countries had to notify the World Trade Organization if they intended to use the waiver, just adding one more bureaucratic hurdle for them to jump over. Moreover, it didn't fund or simplify the transfer of technology to countries that lacked the required infrastructure. Médecins Sans Frontières said, "It doesn't include tests or treatments, it doesn't waive trade secrets, it's too little too late." And this decision by the World Trade Organization showed the world how intellectual property laws can paralyze equitable response during a health emergency. By the time the waiver had passed, supply for vaccines had already outstripped demand in wealthy countries, while some low-income countries were sitting at vaccination rates of less than 5%. If all of this frustrates you, you're not alone. It's frustrating to know that life-saving medicines exist and yet remain out of reach for the people who need them most. And it's frustrating that even in a global emergency, bureaucracy and profits take precedence over timely action. But it's important to remember that even if the systems in place are broken, the people within them aren't all villains. Through every failed waiver, every delayed treatment, and every shelved breakthrough, researchers, doctors, advocates keep pushing forward. They fight for access, they push for change, and they keep chasing better treatments, not because it's profitable, but because it's right. And even when one miracle drug fails, that doesn't mean we stop looking for the next one, because if we gave up every time the system got in the way, where would that leave us? Something that you must understand about science is that we stand on the shoulders of giants, and every failure plants the seeds for future success. Every experiment, every article, every data point contributes to the same overall goal, helping us understand our world a little better. There's no such thing as an unnecessary piece of information in science. Learning what doesn't work is just as important as learning what does. When Alexander Fleming accidentally left out a petri dish full of bacteria, he was shocked to find mold growing, cutting a path through the bacterial growth. He took the mold and named it penicillin. But it wasn't until years later, when Florian Chain continued his research, that penicillin was developed into a widely available antibacterial treatment. If we disregarded every result that didn't work, this foundational discovery of biomedicine would never have happened at all. And that's the beauty of science. Because of all the failed experiments and wasted time, we find breakthroughs in the places we least expect. All of these overhyped articles and publications may not lead directly to a drug on the market, but they give hope to people affected by illnesses around the world. They serve as reminders that people out there are still working to make things better every day. The system is far from perfect. I wish that every time I read about a medical breakthrough, a treatment would be on the shelf the next day. But these stories aren't pointless. They're proof that progress is happening, that people are trying to help, and that there is reason to be hopeful about the future. And above all, you always need to keep in mind that behind every headline is a human being who believes change is possible. That researcher who just published her early findings about a new asthma treatment. She was once a 10-year-old girl who just wanted to play soccer with her sister. And that journalist writing about a potential dementia breakthrough. He'll go home to care for his elderly mother tonight. She doesn't remember his name anymore, but she still knows she loves him.